And that morning, for the first time, authorities had a solid lead. Aron's credit card had been traced to a grocery store in Moab, Utah. Authorities homed in on the parklands in the southeastern part of the state.
We had a direction of travel, and the search crews began to look for the vehicle. It was a question of time and the speed with which we could get there.
Exhausted and overcome with emotion, Donna sank down on the stairs and began to pray.
God, keep him safe. You know, we're coming. He just doesn't know it, but we're coming. Hold on, Aron. Hold on. We'll be there. We're coming. Over and over and over and over.
Somewhere in a canyon in Utah at that hour, Aron was preparing to save himself. There was a real arc between your prayer and what he was doing.
He claims that he felt the surgeons of all the prayers by this time.
In the canyon, Ralston was once again idly chipping away at the rock when his knife brushed the tip of his thumb.
It ripped part of the skin off of my thumb, kind of like the way an old blister will rip away. And so that made me curious, and I started prodding around, and I stuck the knife down in and at my thumb at that spot, and it slid in like I was sliding it into a pat of warm butter, and it went in. I couldn't feel it, of course, but it went in about a ½ inch, and then this hissing sound of gas, the decomposition gases releasing from inside my arm, my hand, where they'd been building up as my hand was decomposing over those 5 days. And that threw me into a panic. It scared me. It appalled me. It was a gruesome concept that my hand was decaying while still attached to my body. And I started yanking my hand, my arm, and I was giving it everything that I had, and was twisting myself around and trying to slide my arm up and down like this. And
then, in an instant, Ralston realized what he had to do to save his life.
It came to me, this epiphany that I could break the bones, because my arm was caught so tightly that I could torque myself. The other bones.
Torque, a basic principle to a former engineer like Ralston. Remember, he had made an initial attempt to amputate his arm 2 days before, only to realize there was no way his pocket knife could slice through the bones. But if he could break them, maybe he'd have a chance. He would have to snap both of the bones in his arm to make it work.
And so I slammed my body against the opposite wall. I grabbed the backside of the boulder and even got my feet up to where I was standing halfway up the wall and grabbing the backside of the rock and humping my body over it until finally that bottom bone snapped. And this pow sound went kind of echoing through the canyon. And I don't even know if I started feeling excited at that point, but I just knew the next thing that I had to do was that I had to break the other bone. And so I grabbed the bottom side of the rock and pushed and tried to sink myself down until I was pushing up to create the downward leverage on the top bone until it too made the same noise, pow, and snapped in the same spot, thankfully, right where my wrist was caught. They both broke right along here, just behind the bones of my wrist.
But now you've got to cut off the arm.
Yeah, and I said to myself, here we go, Aron, you're in it now. And I took my knife.
Its blades were now bent and dull from days of stabbing at the rock.
At first, I still had the larger blade out, and I held it up against my arm, and I started pushing into it, and I couldn't get the knife to sink in, and so I switched over, and I pulled out the smaller blade. And with the smaller blade, then, I actually started the amputation. The smaller one was still a little more sharp.
The smaller blade was just 2 inches long.
I just dove into this exercise, this surgical procedure, and started cutting away. And
he cut through the top layer of skin and muscle until he saw an artery. Only then did he realize he'd forgotten to apply the tourniquet he had fashioned days earlier from the insulated lining of his water bottle.
I put the tourniquet on, and I was bleeding down the wall, and I severed the artery. And
He cut through more muscle and 2 more arteries, then tendon, the most difficult layer. His dull knife was unable to cut through.
It, so I ended up taking the pliers side of the knife and using that to grab and twist and rip until the tendon gave way.
It was slow, painful, excruciating work. He hacked away at his arm for nearly an hour, layer by layer, until he saw what he knew would cause the most intense pain yet.
And then I was looking at the nerve, this little strand of spaghetti running through my arm. And I had to take the knife and pry it up. And even just when I touched it, it felt like the fire of sticking my arm into just a pot of liquid metal. It burned all the way up my arm, and I took it again and lifted it up. I knew it was going to hurt, and I plucked it up and did in a motion like that, and that fire sensation redoubled and went all the way up to my shoulder. But I knew that was the hard part.
It was only a few more moments of work.
After that. And then, boom, and I wasn't even attached anymore, and I fell down like this, and I was free.
You were reborn.
It was the happiest moment of my life, and it's funny to think about it being. There will never be a more powerful experience for me. It was absolutely the greatest feeling to be given the chance to get out of here. Looking down Canyon, I knew I had a hell of a trip left, but at least I was not going to die right here. And the power of that was astonishing.
The crude amputation of his right arm had taken an hour.
I never whimpered, I never made a noise, I never yelled, I didn't whine about what I was doing. I didn't black out. I did what I needed to do right here. And I stopped myself to take a few deep breaths, and then I stood back up on the rocks, and I took my pack, and I took the gear that I knew that I was going to need, and I just started off.
Now he still faced the daunting challenge of escaping the canyon itself. He wasn't far from the entrance, but with his amputated arm still bleeding in a makeshift sling, he'd never be able to scale the 15-foot wall he had descended. He'd have to continue ahead, taking a longer and possibly more treacherous route out. It was uncharted terrain. He knew only that he faced a cliff and a 65-foot rappel at the end. Could he handle all that in his condition? As Ralston prepared to make his final push to escape Blue John Canyon, he had no way of knowing that others were on the move trying to find him. Earlier that morning, Park Ranger Steve Swanky with the National Park Service in Moab, Utah, had gotten a call about a missing hiker with a description of his truck.
We said, yes, we know exactly where that vehicle is, that the vehicle is at the Horseshoe Canyon trailhead. The vehicle's been there for 5 days.
It had not raised suspicions. Visitors to Canyonlands often camp out for days at a time, but now it seemed ominous. Swanky called the sheriff's office to authorize a search and rescue and began to put a command system into place. Swanky also called in a helicopter to speed up the search. Meanwhile, Ralston, his arm in a makeshift tourniquet and sling, was struggling ahead through the depths of Blue John Canyon.
Yep. Your arm is bleeding.
Yeah, I was negotiating all of this with my arm strapped to my chest. I remember in this section I leaned my back against the wall and just kind of slid down into this little We call these the toilet bowls.
Okay, I'm going to let you lead me out here.
Okay. Yeah. This is tight, huh?
It's hard enough to get through with all of your limbs
Yeah.
working.
Under the best of circumstances, it's an extraordinary challenge. The passages are often exceptionally narrow. There are sudden drop-offs. Pools of water turn up in unexpected places with no way to tell how deep.
Okay.
The canyon tunnel is so far down, there is often barely enough light to see.
And now we get to one of every canyoneer's favorite obstacles, the water hazard.
Which way do I want to go?
Face this way. Face the way I am. Okay.
The idea that someone has done this, having just amputated his arm, having not eaten for 5 days, having not had water for 3, is beyond my ability to understand it.
Looking back now, Ralston also can't believe that he was able to make it out.
When I turned the corner here, I knew that I was getting to a place where it opened up. See the
Finally,
opposite wall,
literally,
the extra light.
light at the end of the
It became
tunnel.
obvious, and then I walked out and onto the ledge, and bam, there I was. It's a dramatic entrance into the rest of the canyon, and it was a dramatic entrance for, allegorically speaking, for the rest of my life. That just stepping out here,
So beautiful, for one thing.
it was stunning.
But now, after all that he'd endured, he was still standing on the edge of a 6-story high cliff, and down was the only way out. Somehow, he would have to rappel out with only one arm. Yet another seemingly impossible challenge.
I swooned. I felt faint, and I almost fell over and pitched headfirst over the cliff. And I lost my balance and stepped back.
But Aron Ralston didn't give up. He clipped his climbing harness to the rock so he wouldn't fall, and set to work rigging an anchor and a rappel for the treacherous descent.
Are you up to doing it again?
Yeah. Rope!
Even with the benefit of his prosthesis, it is still a formidable challenge. Once again, Ralston is intent on making this rappel without the help of our guides.
Aron, we can put a rope on you.
Yeah, that's okay. Might not be graceful.
If he slips or loses control, he could plunge to the canyon floor. It's the final obstacle today before he conquers Blue John Canyon again. It is an unnerving rappel, even for an experienced climber. The lip of the cliff juts out. You have to ease off an overhang, trusting that you'll find a foothold to push off the jagged rock.
That's always the hard part.
Even today, it rattles him. As I rappel out of Blue John Canyon, I'm amazed that he was able to do it all that day. The fact that Aron Ralston was able to overcome so many obstacles, missing one arm, in a precarious state of health, it's astonishing.